In this series, we're answering the question, what is the gospel? We said that the gospel is the good news story of God and creation, a story by God about how God is light, life, and love, and a story that invites us to partner with God as he makes a way for creation to come back to life in his very goodness. So now we're digging into this good news story, because when we hear and study and pray about this story, by the power of God, we can live in real relationship with the living God and trust God in a way that changes how we live and the whole world. So, in the words of the great Julie Andrews, let's start at the very beginning. And God's story and the Bible start with the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. He ordered the entire cosmos together, and he gave life to every living thing with just his voice. Then he made us, humanity, distinct from every other living thing by making us in his image. Which just basically means there's something special about humanity that revealed God's self. Next, he blessed humanity, provided for us everything we needed, gave us the job of caring for creation, and placed us in a garden where he could be with us. And at this point, God stopped, took a good look around at everything he made, and behold, it was very good. In fact, it was so good. It was so enough that on the seventh day of creation, God rested. In the story of creation, God's voice speaks and reveals the truth that lights the way for all of creation. The truth that very goodness comes from God. When we live in the light of this truth, when we listen to the voice of God and trust that very goodness comes from God, all of creation can flourish under our care. This means that from the very beginning, God set us up for a whole mode of living in freedom. We're free to make sacrifices for others because we know God will provide. We are free to forgive others because we know God will make everything right. We are free to rest because we know that we have enough and that even God's limits are a means of bringing about very goodness. But not long after this very good creation was put in place, another voice could be heard in the garden. This time, it was a serpent, a creature who found the first woman, Eve, and used his solidarity as a fellow creature to trick her into questioning the goodness of God. And here's how he did it. Even though God made a beautiful garden and gave Eve and the first dude, Adam, everything they needed to live and hung out with them every day, there was one tree in the whole garden they weren't supposed to eat from. So the serpent pointed to what God was holding back, to make Eve start questioning the very goodness of God. And it worked. Eve and Adam ate from the one tree in the garden they weren't supposed to eat from, and they started believing the lie that has denied humanity peace ever since. They believed the lie that humans have to make their own very goodness. And when humanity believes this lie, everything changes. We start to live lives that are self-serving because we think we have to make our own very goodness at the expense of others. Lives that are unforgiving because we think we have to make our own justice. And lives where we are endlessly striving for a very good life that we don't have the power to achieve on our own. Because Adam and Eve didn't trust God's truth the way they were supposed to, they couldn't live in peace with God in the garden the way they were made to. And they had to leave. And then this failure to trust in God as the source of very goodness, a failure we call sin, totally spiraled out of control. The individual sin of Adam and Eve spirals into a family sin when their son Cain is driven by jealousy to kill his brother Abel, which spirals into societal sin that covered the earth and broke God's heart at the time of Noah, and then drove humanity to try to make their own very goodness by literally attempting to build their way to heaven in Babel. So, unfortunately, the story of God and creation starts with the unraveling of God's very good plan as humanity gets swept up in this cycle of sin. Admittedly, the start of the story is a bummer. Wait, didn't we say this was the good news story of God and creation? We did. And that means that God needed a plan to bring humanity back into the light. So what is the plan? Well, think about it. If Eve trusted the serpent's voice because the serpent knew what it was like to be a creature, it meant that God was going to need to partner with creatures, like humans, for example, to communicate the truth of his very goodness. And God starts off this human partnership with one guy, Abraham. First, God lets Abraham in on his plan. Specifically, God says that he's going to bless Abraham's very big family so that Abraham's very big family could be a blessing to the whole rest of the world. God's plan is kind of like when you're at a birthday party and the host starts cutting the cake and passing it around the table. You take a piece and you pass it until everyone has enough because you trust that the host has enough for everyone. God is saying, I have so much cake, and I'm going to give it to your very big family first so that you can pass the cake to the rest of the world. There was just one small problem. Abraham didn't have a very big family. Abraham's wife Sarah was barren, and either way, both Abraham and Sarah were both way too old to have kids. So when God told Abraham that he was going to bless the world through Abraham's very big family, it should have been hard for Abraham to believe God. But Abraham did believe. Abraham believed that God was telling the truth, that God could bring life from his wife's barren womb, and he trusted that God loved humanity enough to bless it and creation enough to save it. In that moment, when he was called, Abraham trusted that God was light, life, and love, the source of very goodness, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Or maybe a better way of saying it is God could work with that. And so God offered to make a partnership agreement called a covenant with Abraham and his family. According to the terms of this agreement, God would forever and no matter what bless this family with very goodness. And Abraham and his family would trust in that very goodness through their obedience and pass the cake. But if you're paying attention, you're probably wondering at this point, how could Abraham and his family hold up their side of the deal when literally no other human being in history has ever been able to trust in God as the source of very goodness? Of course, that was the problem. So here's what happened. The time came for Abraham to sign on the dotted line of this agreement. But in Abraham's time, that's not how covenant agreements were made. At that time and in that culture, the agreement became real and binding by blood. When you entered into this kind of agreement, you were basically saying, if I don't hold up my side of the deal, you have the right to kill me, which is admittedly intense. That's why when the time came to make that agreement, Abraham just couldn't do it. But God, the source of very goodness, didn't give up on Abraham. You see, God signed on the dotted line for them both. God agreed to pay with his own life, with his own blood on Abraham's behalf, even if Abraham or his family were the ones who broke the deal. God loves us so much that when he saw humanity was stuck in the cycle of sin, he knew he had to make a partnership plan that could actually work for humanity. That's why he promised to cover us forever and no matter what, even when we don't live up to our side of the deal. And to be clear, Abraham and his son Isaac, and especially his grandson Jacob, and also very much his great-grandson Joseph, really needed God to cover them forever and no matter what. But Genesis tells the story of how Abraham and his family tried to trust in God's very goodness, how knowing they were covered by God's promise actually enabled them to live lives that were self-sacrificial and forgiving. Genesis also tells the story of how Abraham and his family occasionally failed. Well, maybe more than occasionally. But now we see that these failures aren't sticking around to define Abraham's family. God's promise to cover them forever and no matter what means that this family knows that they can always turn back to God. It means that even when the lie takes them off course, they are never totally lost. And so God's plan was in motion. And here's what I want to leave you with today. We raced through the story of Genesis, but I want to zoom in a little bit on the story of Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Of these patriarchs of Genesis, Jacob has the hardest time trusting God. In fact, you'll probably read his story and think he's a pretty big jerk. Jacob challenges God. He pushes the limits. He lies and he cheats, and at one point he literally wrestles with God. But after this wrestling match, God gives Jacob a new name, Israel. And the family of Abraham becomes known by that name, the name of the one who needed God's forever and no matter what love the most. This good news story of God and creation is not defined by the sin or merit of God's human partners. The hero is not the person who trusts the most or who performs the best for God. The hero of the story is God. God who is faithful to his promises. God who is faithful to this partnership. God whose love is big enough to cover both sides of the deal forever and no matter what. And that is very good news.